Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Thunder, and this is Tenor Talks, and that's the weekly show with my fellow saxophone professor, Dr. Robert Brooks at The Ohio State University. And today's talk is an important one. It's all about transcription. And different folks have different approaches to this. There's different terminology that's used. And yes, there is significant technological advancement that can aid in transcribing. Today's show, to transcribe or not to transcribe, that is the question. Let's go. What's happening?
Hello, good afternoon on this beautiful day we're having.
Yeah, last couple of days been great. Nice.
Yeah, it's been really nice. Nice change of pace.
Absolutely. So I got some new glass.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's a different lens on the camera, and it's a different camera too. But let's see here.
oh yeah, look at that. Autofocus.
Well, the other camera had autofocus, but this camera, it's a prime lens, and so what it does, um, it has a wide. Okay, so it's f1.4. So it means it can take in a lot of light. So like low light, it's pretty cool. And then it's a 16 millimeter uh, uh, view, right? 16 millimeter, which is like perfect for putting the camera about this distance from your face, because then you get all that, you get all bokeh in the background, all of that ring in the background trained on your face. And so that's been something I've wanted to do for a while, but I finally was able to do it. And this is like the second show I've done with the new camera, the new lens.
Nice. Yeah, it looks good.
So I'm happy about that. I got a nice grant, and so I was able to upgrade the camera for my live streaming shows, my live streaming concerts. And so I've got a new camera for
Oh,
that, and that's going to be really great. So I have two really good cameras for those shows. And this is actually back here. This is actually from well, 2 weeks ago, Thursday. It was in March, and so tonight I'm playing a Horace Silver concert, a Horace Silver show. Playing 19 selections, 6 to 10. As soon as our show is over, I'll be getting my suit on, getting my equipment, and getting on over there to the spot, getting all set up. So that's going to be something cool to check out. Speaking of Horace Silver, or jazz in particular,
hmm.
um, you know, a lot of these arrangements that I have were transcribed arrangements, you know, um, and the title of our show today, to transcribe or not to transcribe, that is the question. This is such a common practice in jazz education, is to transcribe, um, and it's interesting because in my own development, solo transcription has not been a primary source of uh, my my development. It's not been a primary source. It wasn't until I got to college, actually, that I actually transcribed anything, and it was two things for college credit, for credit in a class.
Yeah.
Though I haven't transcribed very many solos, I have transcribed a lot of music, a ton of music. So, like, orchestration, like transcribe like a whole, string section on song, or transcribe a whole tune. I've done it a lot with sort of pop music, and I've done it a lot with you know, uh, gospel music, contemporary Christian music. I've done a lot of it there. I've done a lot of it as far as um, orchestral stuff, um, uh, small band, quintet, sextet. I've done a lot of transcriptions of that. But of solos, actual solos, I've not transcribed very much. And I know that's
Hmm.
sort of against the common, the common narrative, the sort of common approach to learning. What I did do was I spent a ton of time training my ears. So from very young, I started when I was 6, and my dad was a great saxophone player, and so he had a particular approach. So he kind of had a sort of negative disposition towards transcribing, because
Hmm.
at least at that time he saw it as people were basically uh, transcribing stuff to sort of cover their own voice up, or to be able to masquerade as if you know they had something meaningful to say, and without
Hmm.
understanding what it was that they were transcribing. So it's like, okay, I got this thing. Now I got some licks and I can play these licks here. Okay, now I sound like I can play.
Yeah.
Um, so that was his sort of disposition about it. So we spent a lot of time doing ear training exercises. And then by the time it came to when it would have made sense to start transcribing, I could hear everything that was going on and play it right back. And so, theoretically, you don't necessarily transcribe something that you can play along with it as you're listening to it.
Mm.
And I see transcribing as a it's like an advanced ear training exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also see it as a primary method for many to acquire vocabulary, to learn how to speak the language. And then there's a couple things that get associated with transcribing, one of which is actually transcribing and the other is not. So you ask somebody, "Hey, what are you working on?" "Well, I'm transcribing, Hank Mobley on Soul Station." "Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Here, can I see the transcription?" "Oh, no. Well, I didn't write it down. Well, you didn't transcribe it then. You learned it by ear. That's great. And that can be
Yeah.
part of the
Mm-hmm.
process, but it's not actually transcribing." So I've said a bunch of stuff. Um, so what are some of your thoughts, maybe some of your early experience transcribing, and then maybe
Sure.
even your sort of thoughts about some of the things that I've said?
Yeah. Well, I know you're going to be frustrated by this, but I agree on pretty much all of it. So it's I I think it's interesting. I think transcription is a really really important tool, but I don't know if it's the most efficient way to learn. I don't know if it's the most efficient way to learn style, the most efficient way to learn language or tone or any one of those things. It is good because it requires you to do all of this stuff. I don't know if it's the most efficient way to get started with your training. But I think for a lot of people, it is very, it's straightforward. I got to be able to play this. And then it hits on a lot of important things. So I think it's in a very important tool, but I think it is can be easy to tell if someone has only ever just learned many solos by ear and they haven't done the other things. Kind of like we were talking about, like the physically writing things out, taking vocabulary from a solo that you've transcribed and putting it in 12 keys, working on ear training exercises outside of that. So it is one thing that has a lot of benefits, but it's a very big task. So my background with that was kind of similar. Neither of my parents are musicians, and so my first experience with a lot of like ear training and things like that was was just listening to music a lot. I kind of joke about it. I grew up in a household that um, music music and musicians were something that were respected, right? And I certainly know how some people where that's not the case, where you need to stop wasting time and take care of this and blah blah blah. And so while my parents don't have a lot of musical background, my grandmother was a music teacher, um, and played a few different instruments, but not anything terribly. Wasn't really a performer, but taught like piano lessons and things like that. But it was always something that where it's like we talk about musicians and we talk about music and we listen to music with great respect. And so it was something that was for me from an early age was, this is a really amazing thing. And I think the thing that I learned from my dad, like I said before, who was not a musician, who would joke, that he plays the radio kind of thing,
Mhm.
was the ability to listen at a deep level, and a part of that was ear training. I where we kind of differed, I think, and I had this experience early on, is that I would listen to a song and he'd be like, "Tell me what you think of this song," and I remember this really clearly. And it was the first time that I realized that I was hearing the music that we were listening to differently than he was. What do you think of this song? We listened to it, and I was like, oh, it's really interesting. I really like this. And I immediately started talking about like the instrumental side. And he was like, oh, that's cool, but the lyrics, what do you
Right.
think about that? And I had
Uh,
like not even considered listening to the words.
Good old
And
bias.
yeah, and it's just one of those things, and it was like, oh, we're experiencing this differently. But truly that, and a lot of the music he listened to was certainly, what I would just kind of lump together as just popular music of either the time or what was pop music at certain times, like classic rock and things like that. But always with, listening to this guitar solo. Who is that? Oh, that's so and so. Oh, who's singing on this song? Oh, that's Paul McCartney. Oh, who is this? And just listening for those things more than just we have music on in the background. It would be, I'm going to put some music on. We're going to listen to this. That's a thing. That is an activity. And just having that kind of respect on it. So for me, I had a lot of this ear training um, that was certainly a lot less formal, but just changed the way I listened to music. And so when I got to college, a lot of that stuff was like really simple, like hearing form, hearing repetition. I didn't have the terms for it. I didn't know to say, oh, that's, I didn't know what like the bridge was or like things like that. But like, oh, I understand this flow. I can keep, and that was something for me that later on in college, when I started taking jazz seriously, so much of that was like intuition. I just never had I never really had trouble like keeping track of the form. I never really had trouble doing that stuff because I was taught from like a young age to, I think, to actually be able to listen to music rather than have it on, is kind of that difference. So, but with transcription, when I started getting serious about playing jazz, that was kind of the first thing that I started doing. And what I noticed for me, that transcription helped me to do more than anything else was deepen that ability to listen. That I would listen to, this John Coltrane solo or Dexter Gordon solo or whomever. And before I transcribed it, I'd be like, wow, I do not know what's going on. But I know this is really good. I know this is authentic. I can tell. And a lot of times I describe that to students as that's what taste is. I can't explain why this is good, but I know it's good. And I can tell when it's not good. I can also tell, I don't know the difference between an incredible solo and a bad solo, but I know that that one is not good and that one is good. And what I noticed after I transcribed is that it would go from hearing like, wow, this really great solo to, oh, I can hear these notes now. And I can hear the phrasing, I can hear the language. Oh, the first time I listened to this Dexter Gordon solo, I didn't realize he played the same lick, in the same place every chorus or something very similar. I remember that one of the first solo transcriptions I did was Cannibal Adderley, Them Dirty Blues. But I think of another one that I think is probably even more on the nose in terms of that repetition concept is Cannibal Adderley on Minority. And if you listen to that solo, and I've transcribed that solo too, in like the seventh and eighth measure, almost every chorus he plays a variation on the same piece of vocabulary. I think it's measure 7 and 8. It's around there. And when you listen to that, you don't hear that stuff. And part of that is because he's doing, it's very seamless and he sounds really good. But after transcription, I noticed that was the biggest thing that I've heard. And I've talked to our students about it. We talked about it a little bit in studio class today, here at Ohio State, is that concept of not understanding how much depth there is. And so I think for some people, transcription can be that gateway. That's certainly how it was for me. I did a lot of Dexter Gordon. Like I said, I think the first one that I did a transcription of was actually This I Dig of You by Hank Mobley. I always say his name last wrong. Mulby. Anyway. And And then I actually ended up doing all of his solos, that whole album. And then I spent probably my maybe next 10 or 12 transcriptions were doing Dexter Gordon. And then I really kind of got away from doing a lot of other full transcriptions of saxophone players. I started doing full transcriptions of not saxophone players. I did, a good amount of like piano players and a good amount of like Clifford Brown and Woody Shaw and particularly trumpet, just because I liked the style and things like that. And I wanted to, and there are certainly things that are idiomatic to the trumpet, or at least not as natural on saxophone that I wanted to kind of incorporate into my playing. Um, and and I kind of started getting into doing one chorus at a time. I had a streak of time during my masters where I would pick one chorus out of an entire solo that I really liked, and I would learn it in all 12 keys instead of doing the whole thing. I would do, or sometimes even just a portion of a solo. Sometimes it was like, oh, I want to learn, the B section and the last A on this chorus of Cherokee in all 12 keys, or whatever it is. And for me, kind of similarly with learning things by ear and transcribing, I didn't write down probably I didn't write down any of the Hank solos. And I didn't write down the first few Dexter Gordon solos. I think the first one I wrote out would have been probably Dexter Gordon Cheesecake. Yeah. And that kind of what you're talking about, it totally changed how I interface with that music. And it was almost, I kind of look back and it was almost like a lot of the transcriptions I did before that like didn't count, or like I left money on the table, maybe is a better way to think about it. There were things to gain in those transcriptions, and the process of writing it out really changed the way that I interfaced with the rhythm. And frankly, it really helped me with sight reading too, just because of the idea of sitting down and like listening to what is that rhythm. And then a lot of times it would be like, oh, that's just like, and one and two or some simple rhythm, but I just wasn't able to think about it in those regards. And then when I would sight read and I would read stuff, it would be like, oh, it's just this. Oh, it's just XYZ. So I think that's kind of a lot of stuff in terms of my background, in terms of some of the other playing and things that I've done. And then now when I transcribe, I really kind of focus on of like finding vocabulary or certain things that catch my ear as something that's unique. I haven't done a full transcription in a while. And I don't want to say I avoid doing saxophone players, but I like doing not saxophone players. And just because of, like I said, of that like different vocabulary and playing things that maybe don't lay as well on saxophone as a way to kind of, add those things to my repertoire. I think the most recent thing I did a transcription of, I transcribed a chorus of There Will Never Be Another You by a really fantastic trumpet player, Tito Carrillo, that I used to study under at the University of Illinois. And then before that, I did a really great keyboard solo by UK-based kind of jazz pianist, kind of jazz fusion kind of stuff, Ollie Howe, which is really, really great. I don't do a ton of it, but the thing that I do now that changes that when I hear somebody play something, especially on a recording, obviously, and I go, ooh, that sounded good. I stop what I'm doing. Let me figure it out really quick. And then, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that was this. Oh, cool. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Put it through a few keys. And then it kind of makes its way into my playing because it's a part of, it's a part of that vocabulary in that way. I think transcription can serve you in a lot of different ways, but I agree. I think writing it down really was like the next level for me. Something that I really never did, I never read transcriptions. I'm not someone that I came to the Omnibook late. I came to the Omnibook probably while I was in grad school. That was certainly not foundational for me. And it was really kind of learning it after the fact. So those were probably some of the only transcriptions I've learned from a page. Most of them was by ear, and then I kind of got into writing some of them out and things like that. Um,
Yeah. So
I
so
was in a sorry.
yeah, yeah. So and I was uh so I'm trying to make a distinction between learning something by ear and transcribing it.
Yeah.
And so it
Hmm.
seems that you've transcribed some things. Mostly, you've learned things from ear by ear,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
it seems that and you just said that you haven't learned very many solos that were already written out first. Um,
Well, not from being written out. Like I'm sure a lot of the Dexter Gordon solos were written by somebody beforehand.
no, no, no.
But
I'm
yeah,
saying
but
you like
like
reading them.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So like that really, I would say I can't think of a solo that I learned from from the page that wasn't in the Omnibook, off the top of my head at least. And a lot of those were things that I worked on as a way to, working on alto playing because I spent a long time playing alto as a classical musician in both in high school and in my undergrad. And so because I was playing alto in that, I switched to tenor for jazz. And so then I started studying with tenor players. So I didn't really start doing a lot of jazz alto until I was in grad school. And it was like, oh, I need to know these solos in Omnibook. And I certainly listened to a lot of Charlie Parker. And then it was learning that stuff through that regard. But I'm not as familiar with that stuff. And I mean, I haven't learned a Charlie Parker by solo by ear personally. I've played through everything in the Omnibook, and I've gotten a good amount of them, like up to speed and playing along and stuff. But that kind of is a little bit different, and so yeah, that's kind of my background in that.
yeah. So this is interesting. So one thing I wanted to say to make clear is uh, I listen to and have listened to a ton of music,
Mm.
constantly listen to music. I share that sort of disposition uh, towards music that Branford is sort of famous for or infamous for when he says that he can't remember the last time that he listened to music for pleasure, or he
Mm.
doesn't listen to music for pleasure. And that's the same thing with me. I don't listen to music for pleasure. I listen to it with a purpose. I want to know
Yeah,
what's going on. I want to understand what's happening. It's one of the reasons why, uh, you know, people around me sometimes they'll have like, here, let's have some soft music in the background. That's the most distracting thing to me. I really have a hard time paying attention because if it's loud enough for me to start hearing what's going on, then it draws all of my attention.
yeah,
And then if too soft for me to really hear, then it's just annoying. Um,
yeah,
and there's certain things that people do with music that I've never really been able to do, like listening to music while you're working on a project or something. Like, okay, I've got this music going on, but I'm really writing this essay. Or I got this music going on, I'm really working on this, whatever this project is, or I'm doing whatever. The music will draw my attention. It makes it really difficult to do anything else. Something else that happens. So my wife in particular, when she's having a hard time sleeping, um, she'll put music on. So
mm.
or my son, if he's having a hard time sleeping, she'll put music on. And I remember when he was really little, and sometimes he'd be in our room, and she'd put this music on, and I'm like, now I'm not going to be able to sleep because
Mm.
she listens to classical music, and it's like relaxing like this. I hear everything,
Yeah,
and I'm like, um, I have to, I'd have to, I might have to get up and go somewhere for a while and come back. later, maybe when when they're asleep, so I can turn the music off. You know, but it's interesting. So music is always going on. I'm always thinking about music. If I have the horn in my hand or not, I'm just always analyzing stuff. I'm always considering what's going on, how something is achieved. So when I said I haven't transcribed, that's not the same as saying that I haven't studied, right? So from all of the constant listening to music and understanding it. See, the reason I didn't transcribe it is because I understood it, right? So the one artist that I didn't really understand that I listened to frequently when I was growing up until I got into college, was Coltrane. I heard Coltrane, and when I say understand, I don't mean that I knew everything about it, because great music you could study for a lifetime and constantly be reevaluating and redefining and learning more, and then that will affect the way that you hear it. What I mean is able to replicate and at least had a working understanding of. It didn't confuse me, put it that way.
Yeah.
Coltrane, though, was one that you could hear where he was coming from, but what he was reaching for, and it wasn't just the notes that he was playing, it was like a certain energy that he was accessing that I just didn't have a frame of reference for that. I couldn't. There was no way that I could get my head around that. So anyhow, but you know, something that I do frequently is, you know, if I hear something that I dig, like maybe Chris Potter plays something, or you know, maybe Michael Brecker plays like a false fingering thing or something. I'm like, oh, let me dissect this. Let me see what this is about, so I can just get the technique, you know, whatever the sort of constituent parts that make it up. And once I decode that, then I'll take that and I'll create a bunch of other exercises based on the same, based on the concept. So I do that frequently. Also, there's a line that I ripped off from Rick Margitza, which, you know, Margitza loves the augmented scale. And he packs all of these augmented scale patterns into this one line that can be used as like a turnaround, or like the last 4 bars of a blues. And I ripped that because in my teaching, I wanted to have something that had a lot of augmented scale stuff in it. I mean, I of course liked what it sounded like. I dissected it. I ripped off the like 4 or 5 different augmented patterns, worked those out, changed those up, did a bunch of stuff, got it in all keys, blah, blah, blah. I did all that stuff with it. But I frequently teach using that line, especially when I was teaching the advanced improv class, where we talk about the augmented scale. So there's been a lot of that kind of stuff, a piecemeal, a little here and a little there. Another thing that I've done is I've actually read a lot of transcriptions, and I actually suggest that students do that just for a couple reasons. The first reason is, okay, so let's get away from the saxophone first. One good thing is, let's talk about the Omni book. So for doublers, grabbing a B flat Omni book and playing clarinet and reading it where it is would expose you to a bunch of technical stuff that sucks on clarinet. Yeah. Also, it would expose you to seeing ledger lines below the staff. Okay, so that's the thing. For flute, I would tell them, okay, take a C Omni book and read it up an octave, because there's going to be a bunch of notes that are out of the flute's range, and it's a good skill to learn how to read stuff up an octave, especially when you're playing flute, because frequently somebody's going to give you music and it's going to be too low for the flute. And I know a lot of people actually are very challenged by reading stuff up the octave because they're not conceptualizing the pitches, they're conceptualizing the fingerings. So
Mm-hmm.
when they see it written, so when I see notes, I'm thinking of them as what the pitch is. So I don't care what
Mm-hmm.
range I play in. I can play it in whatever range. But I started to realize that that's probably something that I learned from. Um, you know, I started playing flute when I was 10, and then a lot of the stuff that I was learning. Of course, I learned a ton of classical literature, the sort of standard reference, progressive and melodious studies, all of that kind of stuff, classical excerpts, all of that. But I also learned, different jazz literature, maybe stuff out of the real book where I had to read it up an octave because it was written too low. And I had to
Hmm.
learn how to take stuff up an octave, adjust the range. Okay, I'll take this up an octave, but I'll play this where it's written. Well, this right here is kind of high. Let me play that down an octave. Learning how to do that without that sort of totally tripping you up. Um, so that's there. As far as playing saxophone, I suggest it because if something has already been transcribed, I do recognize and respect the process of learning something for yourself by ear because that works on something that reading something does not work on. It addresses something that you can't get from just reading it. Okay, I recognize
Yeah.
that. However, with the incredible amount of transcriptions that have been done, it seems to me to perhaps be a more efficient method is to find something that actually hasn't been transcribed and transcribe
Hmm.
that. And then something that already has been transcribed, you can read that, especially if you're not going to learn the whole thing anyway. If you're like, okay, they get to the fourth bar and he plays this really killing 2/5, I want to know what that is. I can spend the
Yeah.
time learning it, which I could hear it anyway, but I could spend the time learning it, or I could say if I open up the Omni book, for instance, or whatever it is, to
Mm-hmm.
such and such a page on the fourth bar, I'm going to see what the line is, and then I could spend the time learning the line in all keys. I could dissect it. I could apply some sort of um, uh, numbering system for the notes, right? I could learn it in all keys. I could take a course, the entire course that was associated with. I could learn that in all keys. I could take the head and learn just the head in all keys. I could do, I could take 4 bars and learn it all keys, whatever it is that I want to do. So that's been a that's been a suggestion and a model that I've used. But of course, the more extensive, better thing to do would be to learn something by ear, then to write it out. And after you write it
Mm-hmm.
out, to write out all the chord changes, to do an analysis, especially of stuff that is really of interest, and then take multiple lines throughout the solo and learn them in all keys. After you learn them in all keys, then start to mess around with them. Can I play this major 2/5 as a minor 2/5? Can I resolve this line here differently? Oh, Charlie Parker tends to use this triplet thing here, this rhythmic thing. Let me see if I can reharmonize that and use that in a different way. Of course, that's going to
Mm-hmm.
be the more extensive. You're going to get way more nutrients out of the project, and that, of course, is
Yeah.
what I teach the students.
Yeah, I agree. I think just being able to play the solo is kind of the first step. You know what I mean? And I agree. All the analysis is important in doing that stuff. I certainly encourage people to use written out solos as like a
Reference.
good reference, but I encourage them to be skeptical. Look at the transcription, and part of this because of how a lot of people interface with their like with written sheet music, especially if you have somebody who is, they're in band, concert band, jazz band when they're in middle school and high school, maybe they take some lessons. They're taught from a very pretty fundamental age that uh that music is correct. You know what I mean? That this is your part. Play it exactly how it's written. Don't question the music. And
Yes.
I, when I'm working with students, um, and they're working on transcriptions and they're doing it from a page where they have the written sheet music. Some of that's a timeline thing. Some of that is, I think all of the ways to transcribe are good. I think it's good to try many different ways, even if you're like, man, this is really tough for me. That's a good
Yeah.
thing you're growing. Um, but I always encourage them to know, like, this is a person did this, so this is fallible, and there is a balance when you're transcribing of, well, is this exactly what's written or what's being played, or is it just make the most sense to write it this way? And there is kind of that balance that I think we all need to be kind of wary. And that's the thing, a lot of times when I talk about the omnibook, you look at the omnibook and I'm like, man, that's not how I would write that down. That's not how I thought of that. Not that it's like a right or wrong thing necessarily. It's that there clearly is a difference
Uh,
between how I'm hearing and how this person heard it, or how the student is hearing it. And you want to make sure that it's your ear gets priority and not your eye.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
I
certainly
mean,
think,
there clearly, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're being very generous. There clearly are some right and wrong ways, and there's clearly some wrong things written in the Omnibook. That's true. It, you
oh
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's it's pretty accurate. It's relatively accurate. It's yeah, there's some gray areas in some places, but then there's flat out like some just wrong notes in like really that's not even the right range. Like what why is that note there? So yeah.
Yeah, and or to me it is what I notice in that too is that it's like over some things are like written to be too complex, where it's like, yeah, that I don't see that as being 16 note triplets. It's just a turn. That's just like a little, that's just a like a like an enclosure or something like that. But I think it's good to be exposed to that stuff, and there are ways to think about it, and so yeah, I'm certainly kind of the mind that that stuff is all very important, and that there are many processes, and that you should, if you haven't written down, learn something by ear and you haven't written down, that's definitely something to do. Something that I learned from a master class I was involved in with the great Dave Liebman was he talked about being able to sing a solo in its entirety on pitch before you ever start putting it on your instrument, right? And that really changed what I was doing. I noticed I was kind of using the brute force method, which was, wow, this sounds great. Let me just, what was that first note? Okay, the first note's in A natural. What was the second note? Oh, it's not this, not that, not that, not that, not that. Oh, G, or something like that. And I really wasn't hearing it at a deep level. And so doing that, I think, is important. So if that's not something that you've had background with, that would be something to add to. And there's all these, um, important like techniques and ideas that go along with transcription. I think it's important, and I do like making that difference, learning by ear versus transcribing. I do like that. I think that's absolutely right. That there is a very big difference with that. However, you assimilate and kind of acquire language and stuff can work, and I think transcription is certainly important. But there's a lot of ways not only to do it, but there's also other ways to get those benefits in doing other things. And so I think there's a lot of background with that. And to me, like I said before, I think the first step to transcription or learning things by ear is being able to accurately hear them. And I think that kind of speaks to the ear training that you're doing. Sometimes that's singing, sometimes that's visualizing, conceptualizing thing. That's always something I'm kind of in the same way. When I'm reading notes, I'm really kind of thinking about their relationship to the chords or what I would hear something like. And so a lot of times, um, it's kind of interesting. So the octave thing really doesn't affect me much. Uh, I have a hard time doing like sight reading, doing sight transposition when it's not B flat, when it's not reading, like playing something on tenor from a concert sheet, I've done that a lot. I can do that pretty well. I have some experience doing that on alto, but not a ton. But other ones where people are like, "Oh, let's play, here's here's a B flat chart, but we're gonna play it, up a major third." It's like, ooh, I really got to think about that because I'm hearing it based on like what I'm hearing is different than what I'm seeing, and that kind of could get me a little bit. But I don't know. That's kind of more of interfacing with the music than it is necessarily learning things by ear or transcribing. But
Yeah,
all
I mean,
those things are important.
I had a composition professor um, from Western Michigan University. I think he's passed away uh, since then. Curtis Smith is his name,
Hmm.
and this guy, he was a great composer. He was a really, really fine teacher. He was my orchestration teacher. I mean, we did private lessons, and I'm writing this piece, and the tendency in my music is for it to be very. It's challenging, and it's all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of stuff going on at the same time. It's unusual at times and stuff like that. That's just the tendency. And so I brought in a piece of music that I had written, and it was a jazz quartet plus a chamber orchestra. And
Yeah.
and it was not a C chart. It was a transpose chart. So everything was in the pitch that the instruments would look at their music in. And he takes the score out, and he's just reading all this stuff, playing it on piano. Oh yeah, this is nice here. Oh yeah, you got interlocking voices here in the strings. Yeah, that's very effective. Oh yeah, it had like French horn. Of course, it had B flat instruments. It had C clef because of viola. It had freaking bass clef. It had some E flat parts, F parts. It had all of these different things, and he's just sight reading this like it's nothing. And I'm like, you're not supposed to be able to do that. Like,
Yeah.
like how would anyone ever learn how to do that? Like, don't do that in front of me. That's what I was thinking when he was doing that. But obviously that's a really good skill, and I submit that it's likely that you could develop that if that was primarily what you did. If all you did was like orchestral writing, then I think that you could get to the point where you could do that. But this was totally sight reading, and it was like a bunch of like abstract stuff, and he was just like nailing all the.
That's interesting.
And it's just crazy. Now you want to talk about actually hearing it in your head, before you're touching your instrument. That obviously was going on with him. The ear training thing is, I see, as I said before, that I see transcription as sort of an advanced ear training.
Mm-hmm.
And in my ear training, one of the I think problems that exists for most of the students that I've had is that they are trying to learn how to hear the interval, and then they extend the interval to what the note is. So, for instance, Boda, okay, that's a fourth. Okay, now let me do math to figure out what the note is. Now, the problem with that is that in real time, it's too slow. If I'm on the bandstand, I'm playing, and the keyboard player plays something, I'm like, ooh. If I know the first note that is played, and if I'm paying attention, then I'll know what that note is, right? So if I know the first note, then I shouldn't have to think of intervals to play the line. And if the line is played quickly anyway, then there's no way that I'm going to be able to repeat back, that I'm going to be able to Um, say for instance, he plays a line at the end of his solo, borrow the line, and then repurpose the line through the solo, right? There's no way that you can do that. You can't get to the sort of higher level functioning stuff if you're still. It's kind of like the people that they're still sort of in sometimes I do this, I might be pointing at myself. It's like people that are counting with their. It's like if somebody says, okay, 5 plus 7, okay, 5, okay, 6, 7, 8, if you're counting with your fingers, you're not going to be able to get to that next, whatever that next stage of the game is, because you're still micromanaging. It's like people that learn how to speed read, for instance. If you're still sounding out the words and you don't just recognize what the words mean, right? If you're saying the words to yourself in your head, you're slowing yourself down. You're never going to be able to, to get to whatever that next level is. And so I think that's a usual issue, and I think it's a problem with the way that most schools teach ear training, because that's all they're doing. They're teaching them, you got solfege and whatever, and they're teaching you, and they're teaching you to hear the intervals, but it never takes that next step, which is, okay, we need to bypass thinking of intervals. You just need to be able to hear what the notes are, right?
Yeah.
And I can hear the notes. So when I'm playing, I'm not thinking, oh yeah, that's a perfect fifth. Oh, it's followed by a tritone and like this. I'm not thinking of that. I just hear what the notes are. I just know what the notes are, and I think that's a problem with the way that people are trained. I think that often is the case is that if you prioritize hearing the interval too much in the beginning without trying to also match that by, okay, but you need to know what the note is, I think people can get into a crutch situation that they'll never be able to overcome. They'll always have to think the interval first before they can hear what the note is. And I just don't think that that's the way that most of the great improvisers that we know, the folks that had these really, and I'm not talking about people with perfect pitch. I don't have perfect pitch. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you can develop relative pitch. If you give me a frame of reference, I can tell you everything you need to know. And that's really what it should be. And I don't have to lean on aspects of music theory, which really are supposed to be the things that you use on the backside. The music theorist is analyzing music after it's already been created.
Yeah.
Right? Now, you can use theory as a shortcut, to learning something. But if you never actually get it in your ear, then it's always just going to be a crutch that you're going to have to rely on, and it can be clunky. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of that? I'm curious as to how you perceive pitch, and when you're like in a playing situation, the way you're thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think for me, I certainly had a lot of that background, like I said before, kind of like pre-ear training stuff, or like more passive approach when I was really young. And then just being around music and stuff like that. When I'm listening to people play, I'm certainly able to hear some of the intervals. I have an idea, especially with saxophone, of like knowing notes, like, oh yeah, that was this, oh that was blah blah blah. For me, I'm hearing and this is kind of where I always kind of poke fun at the jazz as a language thing, because I think that's spot on. I think absolutely jazz is a language. I think a lot of times that's kind of under taught, in that it's just like, well, jazz is like a language, so. And then a lot of times people are like, okay, what does that mean? And then they're like, well, it means jazz is a language, so figure that out. and when you talked about this before, you can't have music on in the background, or it's kind of like that. I'm the same way. I very rarely can't do that. I have to actively tune it out. I have to like tell myself to stop listening. And the other thing that I do, is that I have a really hard time talking when there is music, just like
Oh,
physically speaking.
100%.
Yeah, and it almost like feels rude, or if someone's playing, right? Like if I'm in a room and someone is playing, uh it feels like I'm interrupting them if I talk while they're playing, because it really is that same area of my mind that is being used. And so when I listen to other musicians play, I don't know if I'm really hearing notes in terms of like, oh, that was an A natural, oh, that was like a D flat. I do have some of that where it's, I don't know how conscious it is. I mean, I'm certainly able to do that to a certain extent, but I'm hearing like clusters of intervals. I'm hearing phrases, I hear language a lot of the time. And so it'll be like, oh, I can pick out a collection of notes. Oh, that was this kind of arpeggio. That was this kind of scale. Oh, that was this fragment. Oh, that was, and so it's almost like I'm hearing, similarly to your words analogy, instead of when you read something, I'm not seeing letters. I don't like looking for like, what do all these letters mean? I immediately, as someone who's fluent in a language, I go, oh, that's a word.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing, I'm just kind of looking. I have my email up on the browser, so I'm not seeing like the word leadership or the word information, or I'm not. I am sorry. I am seeing those words. I'm not seeing a bunch of letters, and then I'm like, oh, that's a word there, and I kind of interface with music probably at that level or another step up. Um, it's it's kind of more focused on those larger segments, and so when I'm listening to people, especially with musicians I know well, um there's an element of like knowing what they're saying while they're saying that. And I always kind of joke about that with students. When uh I have a hard time like listening to Dexter Gordon anymore because I know his music so well. It kind of comes off as being kind of predictable. Like I know what he's gonna say. I can like almost play along to a solo that I haven't learned by ear or I haven't transcribed, and be like, well, that's the thing he does. Oh, well, oh, that's a Dexter Gordonism. And you know what I mean? And I'm sure a lot of musicians can do that with people they've studied a lot. But that is really how I interface with the music. And then sometimes I will have a specific note. Oh, that was a G natural. Oh, that was E flat. And then that helps to give me more context. But I'm really kind of hearing no. I'm certainly not hearing music as a collection of individual intervals or pitches. It's very much in context. I think the intervals that I hear more than anything are from like the root of a chord to what that is. So I don't hear an interval like, oh, the distance between these two notes is a minor third. It's like, oh, I heard that you played 3 5 7 or something like that.
Hmm.
But I also hear it more as like, oh, that was an upper structure triad or something. You know what I mean? As like a grouping almost. So,
Here, I want to
but
say
yeah,
this.
but I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
good. Yeah. I want to say this last thing here, and no, we got to get going here. Um,
Mhm.
so, uh, so I said I don't have perfect pitch. I interviewed Damian Dragici and a number of folks that have perfect pitch, and I've interviewed and have had a lot of deep conversations with those that have perfect pitch to sort of decode certain things. It's not the sort of advantage that people present it as. Damian Dragici says that he does have perfect pitch, but he considers perfect to pitch to be on a spectrum. And
Mm.
so if you are able to pick out notes based on timbre, or like for instance, any note played on saxophone, flute, or clarinet, uh, especially saxophone and flute, but also clarinet, I know the note that's being fingered. I don't need a context. So
Yeah.
if they're playing fingering an F, I know it's an F. If they're fingering a D, I know it's a D. It's why when students are playing something and I'm like, hey man, this actually it's a false fingering and he's actually playing B flat, and he's doing this other thing with that. I know what the I know what's going on, and I don't need a frame of reference. They play a note, I know what the note is immediately. Now, maybe that sounds like perfect pitch, but I can't do that with other instruments. So like with piano or something, I can't do that, and I can't do it with, I'm starting to be able to hear some trumpet notes, but I'm not able to do that with any other instrument other than primarily saxophone, but then also flute and clarinet. And those are the ones that I've played the longest. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's interesting. Damien, he says that he thinks that that's a form of perfect pitch because he thinks it's on a spectrum. He says it's on a spectrum.
Yeah.
But most people would not consider that perfect pitch because I can't do it with every instrument. Right. Now, I happen to believe that at least an aspect of what I'm describing is something that can be cultivated, but you'd have to really paying attention to how the notes sound differently, the timbre of the note, where the note is coming out of the horn. So in this, what it is that I'm capable of doing cannot be defeated by detuning the instrument. So a person could take the mouthpiece and shove it in a half so that it'll play a half step sharp. I'm still telling you what notes you're fingering, even though they're a half step, because I can hear the timbre differences in the instrument, right? So now that gets obscured in a section. So for instance, if a tenor and an alto player are playing together, I lose the ability to tell what the notes are because I can't unweave the timbre. They're on top of each. I can't hear, what makes them, open or closed or a little bit sharp or whatever it is that the tendencies are. So, but I think maybe we could do a part 2 of this and maybe get more into ear training, go into depth. I'd be interested in some of the things that you've done in particular for ear training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to talk more about kind of that idea of the spectrum concept, because I totally agree. I think if we have what we think about, perfect pitch is on one side of that spectrum, and the other side of the spectrum is being tone deaf. So there clearly is somewhere in between there. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think we should continue with this for next week. I think it'd be great.
Sure. All right, man. Well, you be well. Everybody, like, share, comment, subscribe, become a channel member where you'll get access to all archived videos, support independent media, become a channel member, blah, blah, blah. Please like the video on the way out. Please go back in the catalog of Tenor Talks and check out all of those videos, and then come back next week at 3 p.m. on Thursday to see another Tenor Talks, and we'll see you next time. Peace out.